Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl with a discussion show on nuclear energy. It is almost 1 year since Japan suffered an earthquake, tsunami, and the calamitous triple meltdown at Fukushima Dai-ichi nuclear power station. The tragedy left 19,000 dead or missing. Fukushima was the world's worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl in the Ukraine in 1986. Most of Japan's reactors are now offline. Germany, Switzerland and Belgium are moving away from nuclear energy. But not everyone has given up on the powers of the atom. Some 60 nuclear plants are currently being built worldwide, 39 of which are in China, India and Russia, according to the World Energy Council. So, what's the best way to help those displaced by the Fukushima nuclear disaster? Has it dashed all hopes of a nuclear renaissance, which was becoming viewed as the answer to polluting fossil fuels? And what about future meltdowns, terrorist attacks, or the worrying link between nuclear energy and weapons? To probe these questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studios. I'm joined by Dr. David Dye from London's Imperial College, Kate Hudson, Director of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, Malcolm Grimston from the think tank Chatham House, and Dr. Benny Peiser from the Global Warming Policy Foundation over the line. Okay, to get the ball rolling, I want to ask a question and get a single sentence answer from each of you to the following. First to you, Dr. David. Should we abandon the nuclear power project altogether?
We don't really have a choice if we're going to meet anything like our carbon commitments to the rest of the world. So, probably not.
And Kate?
Yes, we should.
Quick and simple there. Malcolm?
No, I don't believe that we should, for very much the same reasons that David suggests.
And Dr. Benny?
I don't think it will be decided by the UK alone. I think in the long term we will need nuclear, but much safer forms of nuclear.
Okay, well, there's like a variety of answers, and maybe I'd like to go back to you, Malcolm, because you said no, but for the same reasons.
We need three things from energy. It's got to be economically efficient, it's got to be reliable, and it's got to be economic. And at present, this morning, we had the oil price up at $125 a barrel, which is extremely expensive. It needs to be reliable. Clearly, we can't depend on renewables, which depend on weather conditions when it comes to the baseline energy, the energy we need all the time, although clearly renewables have an important part to play elsewhere. But we can't rely on the wind as to whether we carry out an operation or get ourselves to work and the like. And in terms of the environment, I think we were getting very worried about climate change. I think there's some very worrying indications in the UK and elsewhere that climate change is not taken as seriously by the public as it seemed to be 5 years ago. I think that's a great tragedy. And I think part of that tragedy is caused by the green movement, which has continually got diverted away from the biggest environmental cause towards relatively minor environmental issues like nuclear power.
Okay, and Kate, you didn't equivocate at all. You said straight out yes.
Like many states and people around the world, we believe that nuclear power is not the answer to the world's energy problems. We need energy sources which are safe, economic and clean. Nuclear doesn't meet any of those requirements. We've seen countries like Germany, big industrial powers, deciding to turn away from nuclear energy. They're obviously convinced that you can have a stable and reliable source. The lights haven't gone out in Germany as a result of the closure, the number of reactors and so on. We believe that investment in nuclear power can provide clean, safe and economical fuel, and it will also meet the needs of the population.
And David, your answer was we don't have any choice.
Well, the German plan actually really is to close their nuclear plants over the next 8 or so years, and then buy French nuclear power, and buy coal, and buy gas. And at the moment, in fact, because the gas prices are so high, that plan is running into trouble because gas plants are being shut in Germany, Bloomberg announced last week. So if we are going to meet our energy demands, we can't do it entirely from energy efficiency or from wind. I'd like to push wind as far as we can, but we're not going to get all the way there, and we need something else. There's something else we can do that doesn't involve CO2 is nuclear.
And I think, Benny, that's something you're going to agree on, because you say that we need nuclear, we just need a better kind of nuclear.
Yeah, the problem with nuclear is basically economic. It's not so much the security. It's far too expensive. Nuclear companies are knocking on government doors wanting subsidies, just like the renewable energy industry wants subsidies. It's far too expensive. The price needs to come down. It must become much more competitive, but long term we will need it. However, just to get back to the German example, Germany is indeed phasing out nuclear, but they're currently building 25 new coal-fired power stations. So what is happening in Germany currently is a renaissance of coal, and the worst type of coal, brown coal, night, and the CO2 emissions are going up quite significantly. So because of the fear of nuclear, the green movement shot themselves in a way in the foot.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're hosting a discussion on nuclear energy. I'm joined by Dr. David Dye from London's Imperial College, Kate Hudson, Director of the CND, Malcolm Grimston from the think tank Chatham House, and Dr. Benny Peiser from the Global Warming Policy Foundation. Now, I want to get back onto the bigger arguments around nuclear energy, but first of all, I want to take us back to Japan, back to Fukushima, 1 year on, because the disaster was obviously quite substantial, and it's not as if they resolved all the issues and the cleanup operations yet. Tens of thousands of Japanese people will not be returning to their homes, and there are numerous estimates of the damages which run into trillions of yen. That's the Japanese currency. I'm going to play you a comment now, and this comes from Patrick Fuller. He's with the aid group, the Red Cross, and he's over in Japan.
It's had a huge psychological impact. I mean, particularly for people who've lost family members. You know, they're going through the grieving process, and that will continue way beyond a year. And I think at the moment, 1 year on, this is a particularly poignant, difficult time for those people reflecting back and remembering what happened here. You have to remember there was a big aging population in these areas. Now, they want to attract people to come back to these towns. At the moment, quite a lot of people, they don't feel there's much of a future for them here because there's not many job opportunities. And that's really important. The one thing that's going to bring people back to these areas to give them confidence that these towns have a future is providing jobs.
Now, Kay, I wanted to put that one over to you because I thought it was a dimension that you would probably raise, which is the human tragedy and the scale of the suffering. What do you think about those comments there from the Red Cross?
Well, I think that those are very immediate problems that the Japanese population in that area are facing, massive dislocation and so on. Those problems will be with them for quite a long time, particularly in some areas. But I think that what one has to be aware of as well as those kind of problems is the potential health problems which that population will face in the foreseeable future. Obviously, there are differing scientific reports about the radiation levels in that area. No one wants to make any rash claims, but I think it's important to look at the differing scientific reports around the impact of Chernobyl and the cancer rate impact, particularly childhood leukemia rate impact in that area too. There have been recently two studies of childhood leukemia clusters in the vicinity of nuclear power stations. One, a big German state research project called the KICK study, and more recently a big French research project which shows that there are statistically significant infant leukemia clusters in the vicinity of nuclear power stations, not to do with accidents and disasters, but to do with the everyday running, normal running of nuclear power stations. Nuclear power stations are not safe, and they're not clean either, because if you also take into account the scale of toxic nuclear waste which is produced by power stations, some of it's very low level and doesn't really have an impact. Some of it remains lethally and fatally radioactive for tens of thousands of years, and there's still no safe storage method devised for the safe storage of much of that waste. So, in effect, by choosing nuclear power, we are storing up a kind of future disaster, environmental disaster, health disaster for generations to come. And when there are perfectly viable and reasonable ways of producing power, many of which are emission-free, which if you take the whole production cycle of nuclear power isn't actually emission-free anyway, we need to move away from the idea that nuclear power can solve these problems. It's fraught with absolutely unique dangers. Radiation is a unique danger, and that needs to be moved away from.
Now, Malcolm, I noticed that you were shaking your head during that, but these issues that Kate raises are very, very frightening for many, many people. Radioactivity, cancer, leukemia. I mean, that's why people are so scared of nuclear power stations.
No, I mean, two separate issues there. I mean, firstly, in your introduction, you talked about the 19,000 deaths from the accident. It's worth saying that that was because of the earthquake and the tsunami. The death toll because of Fukushima is negative, because undoubtedly, had the people working at the plant been working anywhere else on the coast, they would have died in the tsunami. It was only because of the robustness of the plant that fortunately they survived. There were 6 deaths, but they were largely because of the flooding and because of the falling stonework. I mean, at Chernobyl, absolutely right. There are large psychological problems as a result of Chernobyl, but with the exception of the thyroid cancers among children, which clearly were a result of Chernobyl, and that was because they didn't get the tablets out in time. The Japanese did manage that. It's practically impossible to find any radiation-related illnesses around Chernobyl. What we must be very careful of is not giving too much credence to those people who, for whatever political reasons, have a vested interest in talking up the health effects, because that clearly does cause damage to people's quality of life and increases the death rate through people smoking more, through alcoholism, through suicides and the like. I live in London. My chance of dying is much, much higher because of the air quality in London than if I lived anywhere within the exclusion zone around Fukushima. Clearly, we do need to make sure that lessons are learnt from any accident, but the idea that the health risks around there are serious compared to the health risks of living in a city is just quite patently not the case. We do seem to have excess leukemia anywhere there is a major industrial installation of any description, whether it's a new town, whether it's the oil industry, whether it's people who were evacuated to rural areas during the Second World War, because leukemia is probably an illness which has an infective agent. And if you compare the levels around the nuclear plants with levels around similar industrial establishments that don't have radiation, you find no health difference whatsoever.
I want to take that opportunity to play another comment, and this comes from a Greenpeace representative over in Japan. His name is Jan van der Put.
Now spending the main resources on decontaminating an area that is already evacuated, and where it will be very difficult and very expensive to get those zones back to a more or less safe situation, is a total mistake on priorities. We should now help the people who are living today in seriously contaminated areas, like between 10 and 20 millisieverts.
Now, David, what he's saying there is that it's going to be almost impossible to make any of this kind of area habitable again. How do you respond to that?
The exclusion zone around Fukushima is quite large. It's about 20-30 kilometres in size. And returning that to a clean state will be enormously expensive. And in some ways, I sympathise with the comment that that money could be better spent on the survivors of the tsunami and the people who used to live in that area. However, we have a duty to come back and clean that area up anyway. The extent to which we do it and the extent to which material is retrievable is as yet unknown, really. It's a matter for the Japanese to assess and decide in due course, I think. I don't think we really know the answers as to what the path of wisdom is there.
And I'm going to throw that one over to you as well, Benny. Do you agree with either of those comments?
I think we have to face reality. Even Japan will have to face reality. The energy demand is enormous. The renewables are not able, at least currently and in the near future, to fill the gap. And so governments that phase out nuclear, as I said, will go to conventional fossil fuel type electricity generation. Energy demand in Asia is going to treble in the next 40 years. They are building everything and anything, including nuclear, including a coal-fired power station every week in China. We have to be realistic. There is no simple, easy solution. But the most important of all is that lessons are learned in terms of safety. But more importantly, we have to produce affordable energy. And for the time being, it's not renewables.
Okay, I want to throw that one back over to you, Kate, because we're talking here about a growing demand in Asia. You're saying nuclear is not the solution, so how are we going to fill the energy gap?
Well, I think there are a number of different options. People keep on talking about the fossil fuels issue and the carbon emissions. Of course, we haven't yet put on the table the carbon capture and storage question. Obviously, somebody here is laughing at me now. But there is considerable research into that globally. There have been a number of pilot projects of that. And all these things start off small, start off expensive. But if you don't invest in them, then you're not going to be able to develop something which ultimately becomes cheaper. The same same thing applies to other forms of renewable energy. There are things like marine energy technology, for example, which Britain would be very well placed to invest in. Investing in that, which would be clean and safe and ultimately cheap, would be a far better option for our government to go down and energy providers to go down than going for something which is expensive, dirty and unsafe. It's to me it seems like a bit of a no-brainer, and I know it's not it's not a popular position with many people, but I think investment in alternatives has to be done. That has to be done by the government. If you look at just the bill for decommissioning nuclear power stations, I mean, I've heard 70 billion for decommissioning the existing nuclear power stations. Maybe it would be more than that. Who's paying that bill, for example? So I think we need a much more constructive and creative approach to alternatives, including things like energy efficiencies, changing people's approach ultimately to the levels of energy consumption that we have, things like switching lights off. I know there's been a bit of an effort around that, but unless you have a government which is willing to move ahead with insulation of homes, for example, to deal with the problem of excess use of energy, those things need to be addressed in a really serious fashion.
Does anybody want to take up on those points? The suggestion is that by using renewable forms of energy and challenging our consumption patterns, we can fulfill our energy needs without having to use nuclear energy.
I'd just make a point that the World Energy Council's estimates for 2030 make some very optimistic assumptions about precisely the things that Kate's just been talking about. They reckon if we do take energy efficiency much, much more seriously, then the world will be using 39% more energy in 2030 than it was in 2010. And that although they assume that the assumption of renewables will grow very rapidly through that period of time, we'll still be, in that scenario, be using a lot more fossil fuel unless we choose for baseload to use nuclear. It is very important to point out that nuclear doesn't compete with renewables. Nuclear provides the energy which is needed day in, day out. Renewables, because they depend on wind conditions or whether the tide's in or whether the sun's out, cannot compete in that market. So we're not looking at whether it's nuclear or renewables. We're looking at whether it's nuclear or coal or gas. Now, as Benny was saying earlier, Germany has very clearly made its decision that it's going to massively increase its greenhouse emissions in order to produce yet less nuclear energy. Italy, which phased out nuclear energy in 1980, did exactly the same. Massive increases in the amount of greenhouse gases produced by Italy because they phased out nuclear power. And we ought to at least be honest that that's the choice that's facing here, because for the last 2 or 3 decades we've been hearing how energy efficiency and renewables are going to revolutionise things. They won't. The problem with renewables is that the wind doesn't blow at the right time, at the right speed all the time. And indeed, the latest research shows that if you increase the amount of wind on the system, you actually increase the total amount of carbon dioxide, because the inefficiency in cranking your coal and gas stations up and down to follow when the wind's blowing means that inefficiency actually increases the greenhouse gas emissions. So wind is actually an extremely expensive way of increasing greenhouse gas emissions, not an extremely expensive way of reducing them.
What I wanted to say is for Britain, we are in a fortunate situation that we might actually have, at least for the next 50 years or so, a real alternative. We don't know yet just the amount of unconventional gas, but it would appear that Britain might be sitting on a gold mine of shale gas. Now, if that were to be true, which obviously we have to establish over the next few years, then we could actually produce very affordable, very cheap, abundant, a new form of energy that is much cleaner, that is cheaper, that is also less carbon intensive. And that might, at least for Britain, might solve a lot of our energy problems, just as it does currently in the U.S. The U.S. has a veritable shale revolution where the price of natural gas has collapsed completely and is transforming the whole energy market. So obviously this isn't true for every country, but Britain might have if we're lucky, might have a solution to a lot of these problems. And of course, if that were to happen, then nuclear power would be in trouble. Because, as I said, nuclear is very expensive, remains very expensive. It depends on subsidies. And if we have a much cheaper and a much safer form of energy, then nuclear would struggle. Like in the U.S., hardly anyone builds nuclear power stations in the U.S. anymore because they have so much cheap gas.
Can I pick up on that? So you're entirely right, Benny. You know, shale gas in the U.S. has taken off in an enormous scale. But gas is really too valuable a fuel to burn to make low-grade heat. It's too useful to make into polymers, into all the other things that we need in our society. And we shouldn't just burn it. We would be much better off.
If it's cheap and it's there and we have enough for 250 years, I don't think anyone would hesitate to use it.
But it just feeds our addictions to fossil fuels and CO2. It carries us along on the path of a society that's going to warm the planet up until the sea levels rise, until half of London ends up flooding every 10 years.
Right. Well, all I'm saying is that it will be far too tempting to leave it in the ground. It will be used as it is used all over the world. Natural gas is already increasing form of energy resource. So I very much doubt that if we have this cheap and abundant resource that we would not use it.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, hosting a discussion on nuclear energy. I'm joined by Dr. David Dye from London's Imperial College, Kate Hudson of the CND, Malcolm Grimston from the think tank Chatham House, and Dr. Benny Peiser from the Global Warming Policy Foundation. Now, we don't have much time left, but there was one issue that I wanted to get onto. Later this month, in a couple of weeks, there's the Nuclear Security Summit in Seoul. A number of heads of state, including US President Barack Obama, are going to be attending, and one of the issues on the agenda is nuclear terrorism, the possibility of a terrorist strike on a nuclear power plant, and another one is this issue of proliferation. If you have the technology to produce nuclear energy, it opens up the possibility of the expansion of that technology towards nuclear weapons, as we have seen in the case of North Korea, as we have seen in the case of Iran. Malcolm, are those kind of dangers just too big to countenance?
I mean, that's certainly very serious danger, and I think that's one of the reasons why retaining a vigorous nuclear industry in the developed world is so important. And let's remember, it's much, much easier to make a nuclear weapon than to make a nuclear power station. The first nuclear weapons exploded in 1945 after 2.5 years of research with 1940s technology. It was another 10 years before we were able to build commercial-scale nuclear power stations. So there's no technical fix. Nuclear energy doesn't cause nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons came first. Now, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been very successful over the years, offers help in civil nuclear technology in return for verifiable demonstrations that you're not using it for military purposes. That's been very successful generally. But of course, Iran and a number of other cases over the year, which have been signatories to the treaty, show that on its own, the treaty doesn't work as a technical fix. We need to use other measures. But I think it would be a very horrendous situation if the developed world did not have an ongoing expertise and understanding of nuclear technology, and therefore wasn't in a position to understand if a country like Iran was diverting material towards weapons purposes, and didn't have the expertise to comment on that and to take it forward. So I think it is one of the very strong arguments for nuclear energy is the concern about nuclear weapons technology.
And Kate, this link is obviously at the core of your organisation, so I'm going to have to let you get in there.
Well, obviously, I take quite the reverse opinion on this. We're opposed to both nuclear power and nuclear weapons, obviously. There is no doubt that there is a very close interlinked relationship between the two technologies, and if countries have the capacity to develop nuclear power for civilian purposes, then they also there is the danger that they will go further down that road of enrichment and so on and produce nuclear weapons. And it seems absolutely bonkers to me to encourage the development of nuclear power globally if you simultaneously want to prevent the development of further nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation. To me, it's just absolutely obvious that neither is necessary for the benefit of the human race, and neither should be pursued.
Okay, we don't have much time left, so I'm going to throw that one back to either David or Benny. Totally bonkers.
Well, my view is that the genie is out of the bottle. We will have to live with nuclear. There's no question that nuclear energy will be the future sometime. It's absolutely out of the question. We have to learn to live with nuclear, but in a much cheaper and much safer way.
Okay, that was Dr. Benny Peiser from the Global Warming Policy Foundation saying that the nuclear genie is out of the bottle. I was also joined by Dr. David Dye from London's Imperial College, Kate Hudson, Director of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and Malcolm Grimston from the think tank Chatham House. You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned. We'll be back shortly.